The stagecoaches near Wheel had come apart on the ridge road above Cedar Creek, and by the time Mabel Hale crested the rise on her father's mule, the whole front boot was already burning, orange tongues licking up the canvas toward the driver's box where a man lay slumped and still against the brake lever. She did not think about it. She threw herself off the mule while it was still moving, stumbled, caught her footing in the ruts, and ran straight for the wreck with her skirts fisted in one hand so she would not trip on them. The horses were down in their traces, screaming, one of them thrashing with a broken leg, and the smoke rolled black and greasy across the road, stinking of lamp oil and hot metal. "Get away from the fire," she shouted to no one, because there was no one else, only the burning coach and the two horses, and when she rounded the splintered wheel, a second man crumpled in the road with blood matting his hair, and a third figure still inside the cab, doubled over the seat, coughing. She went for the one in the road first, checked his throat with 2 fingers the way her father had taught her when the mill saws bit deep into a man's arm, and there was no doctor for 30 miles, found nothing, and moved on. There was no time to grieve a stranger she had never met. The coach groaned, its frame ticking as the fire found the dry wood beneath the paint, and Mabel climbed up onto the step and got her arm under the shoulders of the man still breathing inside. He was tall, even folded up the way he was, and heavier than his lean frame suggested, and he had blood running from a gash above his ear into the collar of a fine gray coat that had no business being on the Cedar Ford Road in October. She hauled him half out of the cab by main strength, her boots slipping on the step, heat pressing against her cheek like a hand, and when the canvas roof caught with a soft whoosh she screamed at him to wake up, though she knew he could not hear her, and dragged him the rest of the way down into the dirt and rolled him twice, coat and all, to smother the sparks that had begun to catch in the wool. She got her hands under his arms and pulled him backward through the ruts, her boots digging, her breath tearing at her chest, until the heat behind her eased and she could feel the cold October wind again instead of the fire's breath. Only then did she let him down and drop to her knees beside him, chest heaving, and look at what she had. A stranger. Soft hands, she noticed first, uncalloused, the nails trimmed close and clean, the kind of hands that had never split a cord of wood or hauled a green log up a skid. A leather bag, scuffed at the corners but well kept, still looped by its strap around one shoulder even now. A gash above his temple that wanted stitching, and blood enough to frighten a person who did not know that scalp wounds always bled worse than they were. The coach finished burning behind her, folding in on itself with a crackle and a long groan of dying wood, and the one horse that could still stand had wrenched itself free of the traces and gone limping off toward the creek, and Mabel Hale knelt in the dirt of the ridge road with a stranger's head in her lap, pressing her apron hard against the wound, and said, mostly to herself, "Well, you have picked a poor road for dying on." The stranger did not die. His eyes came open, gray and unfocused, somewhere in the space it took her to tear a strip from her petticoat and bind it around his skull, and he looked up at her with an expression of such pure, drifting confusion that despite everything, despite the smoke and the dead driver and the ruined coach still smoldering not 20 feet away, she almost laughed. "You are on fire," he said, with the careful, over-enunciated clarity of a man concussed badly enough to have lost track of tense. "I was," she told him. "You are not, thanks to my apron. Can you sit up?" He could not, as it turned out, not without her arm braced under his shoulders, and even then he swayed like a sapling in wind, and she had to half carry, half walk him the 200 yards to where she had left the mule cropping grass at the roadside, entirely unbothered by the smoke, because mules had more sense than horses about most things. She got the stranger up across the mule's back the way she would have loaded a sack of meal, and walked the whole 4 miles back to Cedar Ford, leading the animal by its bridle, because there was no room for her to ride and hold him steady both, and because some things a person simply had to do on their own 2 feet. By the time she came down the last slope to the mill and the cabin behind it, full dark had come on, and with it the hard cold that fell every night now that October was sliding toward November, though the days still carried enough warmth to fool a person into thinking summer had not quite finished with them. Her father came out onto the porch with a lantern raised high, and behind him her brother Daffod, 19 and quick on his feet, already moving toward her before she had said a word. "Mabel." "God in heaven, what happened to you?" Gethin Hale's voice had not lost its Welsh lilt in 4 years on the plains, and it cracked now with worry as he took in his daughter, filthy and singed, leading a mule with an unconscious stranger draped across its back. "Stagecoach came apart on the Ridge Road," Mabel said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "Driver's dead. One passenger too, I think, though I did not have time to be certain. This one was breathing. I could not leave him for the wolves." Daffod was already reaching up to help ease the man down. "Who is he?" "I have not asked him his name," Mabel said. "He has been mostly occupied with informing me that I was on fire." It took both her father and Daffod to get the stranger into the cabin and laid out on the narrow bed in the lean-to-room that had been meant, once, for a hired hand they had never been able to afford. Mabel lit the lamp and set water to boil, and only then, in decent light, got a proper look at the man she had pulled out of a burning coach. He was perhaps 30, clean-jawed beneath several days of stubble, with the kind of face that had clearly spent more time indoors than out, though there was nothing weak in the set of his jaw, even unconscious. His coat, ruined now with scorch marks and blood, was well cut, city cut, and the leather bag she had carried in after him, when she opened it to see if it held anything useful, turned out to be packed with glass vials, rolled bandage, a stethoscope, and a small leather case of surgical instruments that gleamed even in lamplight. "He is a doctor," she said, mostly to herself, and something in her chest eased slightly, because a doctor meant fewer questions about what to do with the wound on his head. At least once he woke enough to instruct her. "A doctor," her father repeated, sitting heavily in the chair by the bed, one hand pressed briefly to his own chest in the way he did now when he was tired, a habit Mabel had begun watching too closely these past months. "Well, if God sent us anyone at all tonight, Mabel, I suppose a doctor is not the worst choice." It took him until well past midnight to wake properly, and when he did, he came up out of sleep the way men did after a blow to the head, all at once and disoriented, reaching for something that was not there, and Mabel was there beside the bed with a cup of willow bark tea her mother had taught her to brew before the fever took her 3 winters past, and she caught his wrist before he could knock the cup from the little table. "Easy," she said. "You are safe. You are in my father's house, near a settlement called Cedar Ford, and you have a considerable lump on your head, which I imagine accounts for the way you are looking at me as though you have never seen a woman before." He blinked at her several times, and something like awareness came into his gray eyes, along with, she thought, a flicker of embarrassment. "I do apologize," he said, and his voice, low and careful, had none of the drawl she was used to from the ranch hands and mill men of the territory. "I believe I am still assembling the particulars. There was a coach." "There was. It is ash now. The driver, dead. I am sorry." He closed his eyes briefly. "And the other passenger?" "An older gentleman, gray whiskers, traveling to Prairie Rose to see his daughter. Also dead, I believe, though I did not have the leisure to be certain of anything but that you were breathing and he was not." She said it plainly because there was no kindness in softening such a thing, only delay. "I am sorry. I could not carry 2 men and lead a mule besides." He absorbed that with a stillness that told her he had absorbed grief before, professionally if nothing else, and then he looked at her properly for the first time, taking in her soot-streaked face, her ruined apron, the raw look of her hands. "You pulled me out," he said slowly, as though only now arriving at the fact, "out of a burning coach." "I did." "That was extraordinarily reckless of you." Mabel felt her spine stiffen, the exhaustion of the last hours curdling fast into something sharper. "I beg your pardon." "I only mean," he said, and had the grace to look faintly alarmed at her tone, "that a burning coach is an unstable thing, and you might easily have been killed attempting to move a man of my size. And I would rather thank you for saving my life than have you think I am ungrateful. Only I am attempting to say both things at once and doing it very badly, which I believe is the head wound speaking rather than my usual manners." Despite herself, despite the ache in every muscle from carrying his dead weight down a smoking road, Mabel felt her mouth twitch. "Your usual manners must be a marvel, then, if this is the diminished version. I have been told they are tolerable." He tried to sit up, made it about halfway, and sank back with a soft, involuntary sound of pain. "Forgive me. I appear to be somewhat less than tolerable at present. You have a concussion and a wound that wanted 8 stitches, which I gave you while you were still out, using a curved needle from your own bag, so I hope you will forgive me if my technique was not what you are accustomed to in whatever fine surgery you came from." That got his attention fully. He reached up gingerly to the bandage at his temple, fingers finding the neat row of stitches beneath the cloth, and something in his face shifted from polite disorientation into genuine, startled respect. "You did this." "I did." "With my instruments." "With your instruments and my mother's steady hand, which she left to me before she died, along with her recipe for willow bark tea, which you should drink before it goes cold because it will help the ache." She held the cup out again, and this time he took it, though his hand trembled faintly doing so, more from shock than weakness, she thought. "My name is Calvin Conroy," he said, after he had swallowed some of the tea and made a face at the bitterness of it. "I am a physician. I was traveling to Cedar Ford under contract with the territorial government to serve as circuit doctor for this district, since the settlements out here have had none since old Dr. Meeks passed on last spring." "Mabel Hale," she said, "this is my father's land and his sawmill on the creek below. You will have all the time in the world to be a doctor to Cedar Ford once you can stand without falling over, Mr. Conroy. For tonight you will drink your tea and sleep, and I will look in on you before dawn to be sure that concussion has not decided to finish what the wreck started." He looked at her for a long moment, gray eyes clearer now, more focused, cataloging her the way she imagined he cataloged a wound before deciding how to treat it. "You are remarkably efficient at giving orders, Miss Hale." "Someone has to be," she said, "in a house with one aging millwright, one 19-year-old boy who thinks he is invincible, and a mule with more sense than either of them." He almost smiled at that, she thought, before the tea and the exhaustion pulled him back under, and she sat by the lamp a while longer, watching the rise and fall of his chest, thinking about the strange, soft hands of a man who had, without question, saved no one and been saved by her, and finding that thought oddly satisfying in a way she did not examine too closely before she finally let herself sleep. He was 3 days abed before he could stand without the room tilting, and in those 3 days Mabel Hale learned a great deal about Calvin Conroy, some of it by watching him, and some of it because he seemed, once his head cleared, entirely willing to talk. He had trained at a medical college in Philadelphia, had practiced there beside his father for 4 years before his father's death left him an inheritance too modest to build the sort of practice he had once imagined, and a restlessness too large to spend the rest of his life stitching the same wealthy patrons his father had stitched for 30 years. He had answered the territorial government's call for circuit physicians because the pay was steady and the need was real, he said, and because Oklahoma Territory, still raw and half-formed only 3 years after its creation, seemed to him a place where a doctor might matter in a way that was harder to feel in a city already thick with them. "You talk like a book," Daffod told him bluntly on the second morning, watching Calvin attempt and fail to properly saddle the mule for a supply trip into Cedar Ford. "I do not think you have ever put a hand on a horse before, doctor or no." "I have put my hand on a great many things," Calvin said, with dignity, fumbling the girth strap for a 3rd time, the horse being an unfortunate exception to my education. Mabel, coming up from the mill with an armful of split kindling, watched this exchange with an expression she did not entirely try to hide. There was something almost endearing about a grown man, clearly intelligent, clearly capable in whatever narrow way his training had made him capable, standing baffled before a task any 10-year-old on the frontier could have managed. It confirmed something she had already begun to suspect, watching his careful speech and his clean hands and the way he had looked, that first night, at her calluses as though they were a curiosity rather than the plain evidence of a life spent working. He is soft, she thought. Educated and gentle-spoken, and no doubt very fine with a needle and thread on a man's scalp, but soft, the way city men were soft, the way her father had warned her certain kinds of men were soft before he sent word back to Wales that his daughter would not be marrying a solicitor's clerk after all, thank you, but a millwright's family bound for the American territories instead. "Let me," she said, and took the girth strap from his hands, cinching it properly in 3 quick motions. "You are meant to tighten it here, not there, or the saddle will slide the moment the mule takes a hill." "I see," Calvin said, watching her hands rather than the strap, which she noticed and chose not to comment on. "You will have to forgive my ignorance. I have spent a great deal of time learning the architecture of the human body and very little learning the architecture of tack." "There is time yet," she said. "Cedar Ford is not a place that will let a man remain ignorant of horses for long." "No," he agreed, looking out at the mill below, where her father's men were stacking rough-cut lumber under a sky gone the pale gold of an autumn afternoon that would, she knew, turn to a hard, bright cold within a few hours of sundown. "I am beginning to understand that." It was on the 3rd day, once Calvin was steady enough to walk the length of the yard without her arm to steady him, that he first saw the ledger. He had come down to the mill itself, curious, he said, to see the operation that had saved his life indirectly by way of saving its owner's daughter's fortitude, and found Gethin Hale sitting on an overturned barrel outside the mill office with a heavy, cloth-bound book open on his knees, and an expression on his weathered face that Calvin, even as a stranger of 3 days, recognized immediately as the look of a man doing arithmetic he did not want to be doing. "Mr. Hale," Calvin said, and Gethin looked up, startled, and closed the ledger a little too quickly. "Dr. Conroy, you are on your feet then. Good, good. I am told I owe your daughter my life and you your hospitality, and I find I have made very poor use of 3 days to properly express gratitude for either." Calvin lowered himself carefully onto a second barrel and nodded toward the ledger. "Forgive me for asking what is plainly none of my business, but you have the look of a man whose numbers have disagreed with him." Gethin was quiet a moment, and then, perhaps because a stranger passing through was easier to speak honestly to than a neighbor who might carry the tale, or perhaps simply because the weight of it had grown too heavy to carry silently any longer, he said, "The mill took a loan 2 years past, Doctor, to rebuild after the creek flooded and took the old dam with it. $500 from the bank in Prairie Rose, at what I was told was a fair rate. The note comes due the 15th of December this year. And you cannot meet it. Not the whole of it, no. We have had a hard season. Half our contracts went to a newer mill downriver that undercut our price, and I have 12 men besides my own family who look to this mill for wages through the winter, most of them with families of their own, Welsh and Irish both, come out on the same land run I did, hoping for something better than what they left." Gethin rubbed a hand over his face. "If I cannot pay, the bank forecloses, and the man who holds controlling interest in that bank is Silas Colgrove, Doctor, and Silas Colgrove does not forgive a debt out of charity." Calvin turned the name over. He had heard it already twice, in passing conversation on his ride out from Prairie Rose, spoken by a stage line agent and a store clerk, both with the particular careful neutrality people reserved for men whose displeasure carried consequences. "I do not know the man," Calvin said, "but I know the sound of a name people are afraid to say plainly. What does he want with your mill, if I may ask? A sawmill on a small creek does not seem, to my admittedly ignorant eye, like a great prize." Gethin's laugh had no humor in it. "It sits square across the surveyed line for a railroad spur, Doctor." The main road is coming through the territory now that the Cherokee outlet has opened up all that land to the north, and every man with $2 to rub together is speculating on where the rails will run. Colgrove wants this creek, this land, and the timber on it, and he would rather buy it for $500 at auction than pay a fair price to a Welsh millwright who will not sell. It was at this point in the conversation, though neither man knew it yet, that Mabel Hale had come up quietly behind them with a bundle of mended harness leather in her arms, and heard enough of it to stop dead in the yard, her jaw set in the particular hard line Calvin had already begun, in 3 short days, to recognize as the look of a woman deciding something. "You did not tell me the date had been moved," she said, and both men turned, startled. "December the 15th. Father, the note was for the spring. March, you said when we took it." Gethin's silence was answer enough. "When?" Mabel demanded. "A letter came a month back," Gethin admitted. "From the bank. Said there had been an amendment to the terms, agreed to at signing, that I simply had forgotten, moving the due date forward on account of some clause about the flood repairs being finished ahead of schedule. I do not remember signing any such amendment, Mabel, and I told them so, and they showed me my own signature on the paper, and I did not know what to say to that, because it looked like my hand. God help me. Though I could swear before any judge in the territory I never signed such a thing." "Then it was forged," Mabel said flatly. "Or you signed something you did not read carefully enough, which I do not believe of you for one moment, Father, because you have never signed a paper in your life without reading it 3 times over. Forgery is a serious accusation to bring against a bank," Calvin said carefully, though something in him, some old professional habit of distrusting a diagnosis that came too neatly packaged, had already begun turning the shape of the problem over. "But it is not an impossible one. I have seen stranger things done with a man's signature by men with money enough to hire a steady hand, and a want of scruples large enough to use it." Mabel looked at him then, really looked, the doctor's soft hands and his careful speech and the way he had, in the space of a few minutes, gone from a helpless patient fumbling a saddle girth to a man quietly, methodically dissecting a problem the way he must once have dissected a difficult case of fever. It did not change her opinion of his uselessness with a mule, but it added something to it, some small new column in her private ledger of him, that she did not yet know what to do with. "If it is forgery," she said, "we will need proof, and proof enough to matter before a court that Colgrove does not already own." "Then," said Calvin Conroy, easing himself up off the barrel with the slow care of a man whose head still ached, but whose mind had plainly fixed on something more interesting than the pain, "I suppose we had better find some." Cedar Ford, when Calvin saw it properly for the first time a week later, riding in beside Mabel on the mule cart with his medical bag between his knees, struck him as a town in the particular state of half-finished hope that seemed to characterize every settlement he had passed through since crossing into the territory. A single wide street of raw lumber storefronts, a church with its steeple not yet raised, a livery, a mercantile with Colgrove's name painted large and fresh across its false front, and beyond the edge of town the survey stakes, already driven, marking out lots for a railroad depot that did not yet exist but which everyone spoke of as though it were already built. The mercantile was where they found Sela's Colgrove, and Calvin understood within 30 seconds of meeting the man why an entire town had learned to speak his name carefully. He was not a large man, nor did he raise his voice, and that, Calvin thought, was precisely the point of him. He wore a suit finer than anything else in Cedar Ford, finer even than Calvin's own ruined gray coat had been before the fire took it, and he had the smooth, unhurried manner of a man who had never once in his life needed to shout to be obeyed. "Miss Hale." Colgrove's eyes went over Mabel with an assessing courtesy that made Calvin's jaw tighten for reasons he did not examine too closely. "And this must be the new circuit doctor I have heard so much about. The one who arrived in the territory by way of a burning stagecoach and your family's hospitality. Quite the introduction to Cedar Ford, Dr. Conroy. Quite, Calvin agreed evenly. I understand you hold the note on the Hale sawmill, Mr. Colgrove. Something flickered behind Colgrove's pleasant expression, gone almost before Calvin could name it. I hold controlling interest in the bank that holds the note, which is a somewhat different matter, but yes. A sad business, Doctor. Gethin Hale is a fine man, and it pains me to see hard times fall on a fine man. I have told him myself I would be glad to purchase the mill outright, sparing him the indignity of a foreclosure auction, and at a fair price besides. A fair price being considerably less than what the land will be worth once your railroad spur runs through it, Mabel said. Colgrove's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes went very still. There is no railroad spur, Miss Hale, only survey speculation, the kind that runs through every territory town this side of the Cherokee outlet these days. I would be careful repeating such rumors. A man's reputation is a delicate thing out here, and I have found that certain rumors, once spoken aloud in a place like this, have a way of causing trouble for the person who spoke them rather than the person they concern. It was said pleasantly. It was said, Calvin thought, in exactly the tone a man might use to remark on the weather, and that was precisely what made it a threat rather than an observation, and he saw Mabel understand it as such, saw her spine straighten and her chin come up, and felt something in his own chest go tight and protective in a way he had not felt in a very long time, not since his father's funeral, not since he had stood over a body he loved and felt entirely, uselessly helpless. I will thank you, Calvin said, before he had entirely decided to speak, not to threaten the woman who saved my life, Mr. Colgrove, whatever your business with her father. Colgrove turned that pleasant, assessing gaze on Calvin fully now, and for the first time Calvin saw something calculating move behind it, a man revising an estimate. Doctor, I did not threaten anyone. I gave friendly advice, which I would extend to you as well, since you are new to the territory and no doubt hoping to build a practice here that depends on the goodwill of its more established citizens. Judge Prout rides the circuit through Cedar Ford twice a year to hear claims and settle debts, and he is, I think you will find, a reasonable man, provided the matters brought before him are equally reasonable ones. I would not want to see either of you waste his patience, or mine, chasing rumors. He touched his hat then with perfect courtesy, and left them standing in the mercantile amid the smell of coffee beans and new rope, and it was a long moment before either of them spoke. He is going to take the mill, Mabel said quietly, whatever we find, whatever proof there is. He has the judge, and he has the bank, and he has a town full of people too afraid of him to speak against him in open court. Then we will need more than proof for a court that fears him, Calvin said. We will need proof loud enough and public enough. That fear will not be sufficient to bury it. She looked at him then, and there was something new in her expression, something that had not been there a week ago when she had looked at his soft hands and his fumbling with the mule's girth strap, and quietly filed him away as a man of no particular use outside a sick room. That is a very clever thing to say for a man who cannot yet saddle a horse without assistance, Dr. Conroy. I contain multitudes, Miss Hale, he said, and was rewarded, for the first time since she had pulled him from the fire, with the sight of her laughing, quick and surprised, before she caught herself and turned it into something more composed, though the warmth of it lingered in her eyes a moment longer than she likely intended. The days that followed took on a rhythm Calvin had not expected to find comfortable so quickly. He rode the circuit, as his contract demanded, out to Elm Grove and Split Rock and the scattered claims between, setting bones and lancing infections and delivering, on one memorable and terrifying night, a breech baby to a Kiowa mother whose husband had ridden 11 miles to fetch him, and who thanked him afterward with a solemnity that humbled him more than any fee ever had. But always he returned to Cedar Ford, to the Hale cabin by the mill, because the territorial government's arrangement allowed him to keep his base of operations wherever he chose within his district, and he chose, with a certainty that surprised him, the small lean-to room where he had first woken to Mabel Hale's voice telling him he was on fire. He learned to saddle the mule properly within a week, under Daffod's patient, occasionally mocking instruction. He learned, more slowly and with considerably more bruised dignity, to swing an axe without nearly removing his own foot, taught by Mabel herself one cold afternoon when she had come upon him attempting it alone and could not, she said, in good conscience let him maim himself on her family's woodpile when she had gone to such trouble keeping him alive already. "You are doing it wrong," she told him, not unkindly, taking the axe from his hands. "You are trying to cut through the wood as though it were flesh, all delicacy and precision. Wood wants force behind the swing, not care." She demonstrated, splitting a round of oak clean in half with an ease that made him newly aware of the muscle beneath her sleeve, the years of labor that had built it. "I begin to think," he said, watching her, "that you regard everything I know as somewhat beside the point out here." "Not beside the point." She set another round on the block. "Only incomplete. You know how to mend a body once it is broken." "That is no small thing, Dr. Conroy, and I do not say it lightly. Having watched you set Tomo's Price's arm last week with more gentleness than I have seen most men show a frightened animal, let alone a boy of 12. But knowing how to mend a body is not the same as knowing how to survive out here long enough to need mending, and I confess I did not think, that first night, watching you fumble the mule's girth, that you understood the difference. And now," she considered the question seriously, setting the axe down, wiping her palms on her skirt. "Now I think you are a man who has spent his whole life being clever in rooms where cleverness was sufficient, and you have come to a place where it is not sufficient on its own, and rather than resent that, as I half expected you would, you have simply set about learning what else is required. That is not nothing, doctor. Most men your age with your learning would consider it beneath them. I have found," Calvin said, "that very little is beneath a man who has been rescued from a burning coach by a woman half his size and twice his competence in every practical matter. It rather clarifies one's priorities." Mabel's mouth curved, and this time she did not try to smooth the smile away. "I am not half your size, Dr. Conroy." "No," he agreed, looking at her properly, at the strength in her shoulders and the steadiness in her eyes and the small scar along her jaw. She had told him, one evening by the fire, came from a saw kickback when she was 15 and had insisted, over her father's objections, on learning the mill work alongside her brother. "No, I do not suppose you are." It was 2 nights after that, with the first real frost of the season silvering the ground and the temperature dropping hard the moment the sun went down, that Daffod came running up from the mill shouting for his sister, and Calvin followed at a dead run without waiting to be asked, because whatever news made a 19-year-old boy's voice crack like that was news that would need a doctor's hands as much as anyone's. It was not, thank God, a man hurt, but the mill's main drive belt, sabotaged, cut clean through in the dark by someone who had known exactly where to cut it to do the most damage and leave the least evidence, so that the saw blade had seized and very nearly taken off the hand of the night watchman, an older Irish mill hand named Patrick Deely, who had been checking the belt tension when it gave way. "It was cut," Daffod said, breathless, holding the lantern while Calvin knelt to examine Deely's hand, badly bruised but mercifully unbroken. "I found the ends, Mabel. Cut clean, not frayed. Someone did this on purpose." Mabel's face in the lantern light had gone the particular still, cold pale of a person containing a great deal of fury through sheer force of will. "Call Grove." "We cannot prove that," Calvin said, working carefully over Deely's hand, wrapping it, watching for the signs of broken bone he did not thankfully find. "Not yet, but I do not think it coincidence that this happens a week after we asked him about the note." "It does not need to be provable to us," Mabel said. "It needs to be provable to a judge, and that judge is his judge, and so nothing will ever be provable at all unless we take it somewhere he does not own." She looked at Calvin over Deely's bandaged hand, and something had settled in her expression, some decision finally made. There was a clerk at the bank in Prairie Rose, Ezra Whitcomb. He handled the original loan papers, and I have heard, from one of the mill men whose sister works at the boarding house there, that he quit his position not 2 weeks past and left town rather suddenly, in the middle of the night, without collecting his final wages. A man does not do that unless he is running from something or toward telling someone the truth of it. Then we find him, Calvin said. We, Mabel repeated, testing the word. We, Calvin said again firmly, and did not look away from her. I did not come to this territory to watch a good family lose everything to a man with a fine suit and a rented judge, Miss Hale. And I find, quite against my own expectations, that I would very much like to be of use to you, in whatever capacity you will permit. Something passed between them in the lantern light, something neither of them named aloud, but which settled into the space between them like a promise made and understood without words, and Dealey, watching them both with the amused patience of a man 3 times their age, said dryly, "If the two of you are quite finished courting over my broken hand, I would appreciate someone fetching me a drink." They rode for Prairie Rose the next morning before dawn, Mabel on the mule and Calvin on a borrowed horse. He managed, this time, to saddle himself, and the frost on the grass had not yet burned off when they crossed the low ford above the mill and turned onto the road that ran the 18 miles to the larger town. They found Ezra Whitcomb, after some careful and quiet asking that avoided anyone with reason to carry tales back to Colgrove, at a widow's boarding house on the far edge of Prairie Rose. A thin, nervous man of perhaps 40, who startled badly at the knock on his door, and did not open it until Mabel called through the wood that she had come from Gethin Hale's family and meant him no harm. "I cannot help you," Whitcomb said, before either of them had said more than a few words, sitting hunched at the small table in his rented room with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he did not drink. "I have already lost my position. I will not lose more than that. Mr. Colgrove is not a man who forgives being crossed twice. We do not ask you to cross him," Calvin said gently, drawing on the same steady, unhurried voice he used with frightened patience before a difficult procedure. "We ask only for the truth of what you saw, Mr. Whitcomb, and what you do with that truth after you have told it to us is entirely your own choice." Whitcomb's hands tightened on the cup. "I drew up the original note for the Hale Mill myself. $500, due the 15th of March, at 8%, which was the fair territorial rate. I know it was March because I remember thinking it a kindness, giving them through the whole winter and into spring before the note came due, so the mill would have a full season's contracts behind it." He swallowed. "6 weeks ago, Mr. Colgrove came to me himself, after hours, and had me draw up an amended page, moving the date to December and altering the rate besides, and told me to copy Gethin Hale's signature from the original note onto the new page, tracing it exact, and file it as though it had always been part of the agreement." "And you did," Mabel said, not unkindly, understanding written plain on her face, the understanding of a woman who knew exactly what it cost a poor man to refuse his employer anything. "I did. God forgive me, I did, because I have a wife and 2 children, and Mr. Colgrove made it very clear what refusing would cost me. But I could not keep working there afterward, knowing what I had helped him do to a good family, so I left, and I have been trying since to decide what, if anything, I owed the truth." He looked up at them both, misery plain on his thin face. "Will you tell me what happens to me if I speak of this before a court?" "I will tell you what I know of the law in this territory," Calvin said, "which is not so very much, having only lived in it these few weeks. But I know that forgery and fraud are federal matters when they concern a territorial bank's records, and a deputy United States Marshal out of Guthrie has authority here that Judge Pruitt's court does not. I know also that a man who comes forward of his own accord to correct a wrong he was coerced into is generally treated with a great deal more mercy than a man who is caught and drags his crime out only under pressure. I cannot promise you safety, Mr. Whitcomb. I can only promise you that the alternative, silence, protects no one, least of all yourself, since a man like Colgrove has little use for witnesses to his own crimes once those crimes are no longer needed. Whitcomb was quiet a long while, staring into his cold coffee, and then at last he nodded, slow and heavy, like a man setting down a weight he had carried too long. I have the original page still. I kept it when I traced the forgery. I do not entirely know why, except that some part of me knew even then I might need it someday to prove what had truly been agreed. It is sewn into the lining of my traveling case. It took him a few minutes to retrieve it, hands shaking, and when he laid the folded page on the small table between them, Calvin and Mabel bent over it together, shoulders nearly touching, and saw there, in Gethin Hale's own plain, careful hand, the original terms: March 8%, nothing altered, nothing forged, everything Colgrove's rewritten page had erased. "This is enough," Mabel breathed. "This is more than enough." "It is enough to prove the forgery," Calvin agreed, "provided we can get it before someone who will not simply hand it to Colgrove the moment our backs are turned." They left Prairie Rose that same afternoon, the original loan page wrapped carefully in oilcloth inside Calvin's medical bag, tucked beneath the surgical instruments where a casual search would not think to look, and Whitcomb's promise, extracted with some difficulty, to remain where he was for 2 more days until they could arrange proper protection for him, since a man could not testify from a shallow grave. They did not, however, reach Cedar Ford unremarked. 2 miles outside town, on the stretch of road that ran through a stand of cottonwoods along the creek, 3 riders fell in behind them, unhurried at first, then closing distance with a deliberateness that made the hair on the back of Calvin's neck rise even before Mabel, riding just ahead, turned in her saddle and said, low and urgent, "Do not run. Running tells them we have something worth chasing." "We do have something worth chasing," Calvin said, matching her pace, forcing his own breathing steady, drawing on whatever calm he had ever managed in an operating room with a patient's life balanced on his hands. "They do not know that yet. They may only be sent to frighten us." She did not sound entirely convinced of her own reassurance. "There is a line shack ahead, where the road forks toward the old ferry crossing. If we can reach it before they close the distance, we can bar the door and wait them out until someone from town comes along the road. And if they reach us first, then you will find out how well I taught you to use that pistol Daffod gave you," Mabel said, and there was something almost fierce in her voice. Exhilaration threaded through the fear, and Calvin, absurdly, found himself grinning despite the danger, because he had never in his life felt so entirely, thoroughly alive as he did riding hard down a frost-bitten road beside Mabel Hale with something worth protecting tucked against his ribs. They did not reach the line shack. The riders cut the distance faster than either of them expected, spreading out to flank the road, and Mabel, with a presence of mind that left Calvin briefly breathless with admiration even as his heart hammered with fear for her, wheeled her mule off the road entirely, and down the steep bank toward the creek, shouting for him to follow, and he did, trusting her judgment over his own instinct to stay on solid ground. And the 2 of them went crashing down through the cottonwoods and out along the creek bed itself, where the mule's sure feet and the horse's longer stride carried them through shallow water and over slick stone faster than 3 riders unfamiliar with the terrain could easily. "Follow the mill flume," Mabel called back to him, breathless, as they came up out of the creek bed a 1/4 mile on. "If we can reach the head gate before they catch us on the road again, I can drop the water level and flood the low crossing behind us. It will not stop them for long, but it will stop them long enough." It worked exactly as she said it would. They reached the mill's upper head gate with the 3 riders still 100 yards behind and closing on the road above, and Mabel threw her weight against the old iron wheel that controlled the flow, and Calvin threw his weight in beside hers, and together they wrenched it open, and a rush of creek water surged down through the old flood channel, and across the low ford, the riders would have to cross to reach the mill road, turning solid ground into a churning brown torrent in a matter of seconds. The riders pulled up hard at the water's edge, and one of them, cursing loud enough to carry across the distance, shouted something Calvin could not make out, and then, weighing the risk of fording a suddenly flooded creek against whatever they had been paid to do, they turned their horses and rode back the way they had come. Mabel and Calvin stood at the head gate, both soaked to the knee, both breathing hard, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, and then Calvin began, helplessly, to laugh, the release of terror finding no other outlet, and Mabel, after a startled beat, laughed with him, until they were both leaning against the old wooden gate structure, gasping, half from fear and half from something that felt absurdly like joy. "You are a remarkable woman, Mabel Hale," Calvin said, when he had breath enough to say anything at all. "You did not do so badly yourself, Dr. Conroy," she said, "for a man who could not saddle a mule 3 weeks ago." He looked at her then, water dripping from the hem of her skirt, her hair come loose from its pins and clinging damp to her flushed cheeks, and felt something in his chest turn over entirely, some final barrier giving way that he had not even fully realized he was holding up. "May I tell you something, Miss Hale, that I have not yet had the courage to say plainly?" "You may." "I did not come to this territory looking for a wife. I came looking for purpose and patience and perhaps some measure of peace after my father's death, and I expected, if I am honest, a great deal of loneliness along with it, the kind of loneliness that comes from serving people you will never truly belong among." He took a breath. "I did not expect a woman to pull me from a burning coach and then proceed, over the course of a few short weeks, to entirely dismantle every assumption I had ever held about what made a person strong, or what made them worth loving. I find myself, Mabel, in the somewhat undignified position of having fallen in love with you, and I am uncertain what, if anything, you would wish me to do about that fact." Mabel was quiet a long moment, water still dripping from her sleeve, the mill wheel turning slow and steady behind her in the newly flooded channel, and when she finally spoke, her voice was rougher than usual, stripped of its usual composure. "I thought you soft that first night. I will admit that to you plainly, since you have been plain with me. I thought a man with such careful speech and such unmarked hands could not possibly survive out here, let alone be of any real use to me or to my family beyond his stitching. And now I think," she said, "that I have watched you learn to swing an axe and saddle a horse and outride 3 armed men through a creek bed without once complaining that any of it was beneath you. And I think that a man who can do that, who chooses to do that for people who owe him nothing, is not soft at all. He is only differently made than the men I have known before, and perhaps that is not a flaw, Calvin Conroy. Perhaps that is simply who you are, and I find, to my own considerable surprise, that I do not wish you to be any other way." It was the first time she had used his given name, and he heard it land between them like a small, deliberate gift, and when he reached for her hand, cold and damp from the creek water, she let him take it, and neither of them said anything more for a long moment, standing together at the head gate in the last gold light of the afternoon, the mill turning steadily behind them, the whole uncertain future of the winter ahead of them both, and yet, for that one suspended moment, entirely unafraid of it. The reprieve did not last. 2 days later, word came that Judge Prout had moved the foreclosure auction forward, from the 15th of December to the very next market day, when Prairie Rose held its autumn cattle sale, and half the territory's ranchers and buyers would already be gathered in the town for the annual event. Colgrove, they understood at once, meant to force the sale through in front of the largest possible crowd, betting that public spectacle and the pressure of a packed square would leave no room for objection. And worse, word reached them through the mill hand's sister that Ezra Whitcomb had vanished from his boarding house 2 nights past, his room left undisturbed, his few belongings still there, and no one in Prairie Rose willing to say where he had gone or admit to having seen anything at all. "He has been taken, or frightened off, or worse," Mabel said, pacing the small mill office with a fury that made the floorboards creak. "And without him standing before the court to speak the truth of what he told us, we have only a piece of paper that could as easily have come from anywhere." "It has his hand on it," Calvin said, "and Gethin's signature beside it, unaltered, easily compared to any other document your father has ever signed. A page alone will not carry the same weight as a living witness, but it is not nothing, Mabel. And we have 3 days yet before the market. That is not so little time as it feels." Gethin, who had said very little through the whole of this, sitting heavily in his chair with the particular gray pallor that had begun to worry Calvin more than he let on, finally spoke. "Even if you prove the forgery, Doctor, even if the court admits the true date was March and not December, the debt is still real, $500, and the mill has not the contracts to earn it by spring either, not with Colgrove's downriver mill undercutting every price we offer. Proving the forgery buys us a few months, nothing more. Colgrove will simply wait and take the mill in March instead of December, and 12 families will lose their winter wages either way, because I will have spent every penny I have defending a debt I cannot in the end escape paying." The room was quiet after that, and Calvin found himself looking at the ledger open on the desk, the careful, worried figures in Gethin's hand, the long column of names beside wages owed, Dealey and Price and half a dozen others, men with children and wives and no other work within 30 miles once the ground froze hard enough to stop the timber trade entirely until spring thaw. He thought of his father's estate, sold at last the previous year after long negotiation, the modest sum banked in Guthrie against the day he might build a proper hospital somewhere in the territory, a dream he had carried west with him and had not, until this moment, considered spending on anything else. He thought of Mabel pulling him from a burning coach without a single moment's hesitation for her own safety, and of the weeks since, learning to be useful in a world that had never asked anything useful of him before, and of the strange, fierce, entirely unexpected love that had grown up between them in the space of a single autumn. "What if the debt were simply paid," he said slowly, "and the mill sold fairly at whatever price the forged terms cannot claim, to someone who has no interest in a railroad spur and every interest in the mill remaining exactly as it is, run by the family that built it?" Mabel turned to look at him. "You are speaking of yourself." "I am speaking of $500 and a small remainder besides, sitting in a bank in Guthrie doing nothing more useful than gathering dust," Calvin said. "I had thought to spend it on a hospital someday. I find I would rather spend it keeping 12 families fed through a winter and giving the woman I love a fighting chance to keep the land her father crossed an ocean to claim. If your father will have me as a partner in the enterprise, Mabel, rather than a stranger buying up his life's work out from under him, I would count it the finest use I have ever made of my father's money." Gethin Hale, who had listened to this with his face unreadable, finally spoke, his voice thick. "You would do that, for strangers, for a family you have known scarcely a month." "I would do it," Calvin said, "for the woman who is not a stranger to me at all, whatever else I may be to the rest of you, and I would consider it an honor to earn the trust of her family in whatever way I am able." It was Mabel who crossed the room first, and it was Mabel who kissed him, there in the mill office with her father watching and the afternoon light slanting gold through the dusty window. And it was not a gentle kiss, nor a careful one, but the kind that came from a person who had spent weeks holding back a feeling too large for careful words, and Calvin met it with everything he had been holding back as well. And when they finally drew apart, breathless, Gethin was smiling, actually smiling. The first Calvin had seen from him in days. "Well," the old man said, "I suppose that settles the matter of whether the doctor is soft at least." The autumn cattle market at Prairie Rose was, that year, the largest anyone in the territory could remember, swollen by the flood of new claims from the Cherokee outlet run just weeks before, and the speculation that had brought half the territory's cattle to a single square, hoping to catch the best price before winter closed the trails. Wagons and pens crowded the open lot behind the mercantile, the smell of livestock and roasting corn and wood smoke thick in the cold morning air. And by the time Judge Pruitt's makeshift court convened on the courthouse steps at midday, with the foreclosure notice for the Hale sawmill posted plain for all to see, a crowd several hundred strong had gathered, drawn by curiosity as much as commerce. Colgrove stood near the steps in his fine coat, entirely at ease, and beside him stood two men Calvin recognized, with a cold jolt, as among the three who had chased them along the creek road, and it was one of these men, Calvin understood with growing dread, who would be the sole bidder Colgrove had arranged, ready to purchase the mill for a token sum the moment the judge called the sale, with no other buyer in the crowd willing to bid against a man everyone in Prairie Rose had learned, by hard experience, not to cross. "Let it be recorded," Judge Pruitt called out, in the flat, bored tone of a man performing a formality he had already decided the outcome of, that the note held against the property of Gethin Hale, being in default as of the 15th instant, is hereby offered for public sale to satisfy the debt. "I object to the terms of that debt," Mabel Hale said, stepping forward from the crowd before the judge had finished speaking, her voice carrying clear and steady across the square, and a murmur ran through the gathered ranchers and buyers, because a woman speaking out in a territorial court was not a common thing, and a woman speaking out against Silas Colgrove was rarer still. "Miss Hale," Judge Pruitt said, with the weary patience of a man who found the interruption tiresome rather than alarming, "this is not the appropriate venue for a dispute of contract terms. If you wish to file a formal challenge, you may do so through proper channels." "The proper channel," Calvin Conroy said, stepping up beside her, his voice pitched to carry as well, "is precisely this one, Your Honor, since the fraud in question was committed to force this sale before those proper channels could be exhausted." He held up the oilcloth-wrapped page, unfolding it for the crowd to see. "This is the original loan agreement between Gethin Hale and the First Territorial Bank, drawn and signed the spring before last, setting the due date at the 15th of March next, not December of this year. I have here also a sworn statement, taken before witnesses in Prairie Rose 2 days past, from Mr. Ezra Whitcomb, the bank clerk who drew up this original document, describing how he was coerced by Mr. Colgrove himself into forging an amended page, tracing Gethin Hale's own signature, to move that date forward by 3 months and force this very default." The murmur in the crowd rose into something louder, sharper, and Calvin saw Colgrove's composed expression crack, just slightly at the edges, his eyes going hard and flat. "A convenient story," Colgrove said, "from a clerk who abandoned his post and cannot be found to answer for it." "He can be found," said a voice from the back of the crowd, and every head turned as Ezra Whitcomb himself pushed forward, thin and pale but standing straight, flanked by a man in a Deputy United States Marshal's badge that Calvin had, in the 2 frantic days since Whitcomb's disappearance, ridden hard to Guthrie to secure, laying before the Federal Land Office everything he and Mabel had gathered, and finding, to his profound relief, a marshal willing to ride back with him on the strength of the forged bank document alone. "Mr. Colgrove had me removed from Prairie Rose 3 nights past," Whitcomb said, his voice shaking but clear, "held against my will at a line camp north of here, to keep me from speaking before this court. I would not have been found at all had Deputy Marshal Root here not been already riding this way on the strength of the doctor's report to the land office in Guthrie." The crowd had gone entirely silent now, and into that silence, Judge Pruitt, who had plainly not accounted for a deputy federal marshal appearing in the middle of his tidy little sale, sat very still on the courthouse steps, and Calvin watched the man's face perform a rapid, visible calculation of exactly how much protection Silas Colgrove's friendship was worth against the weight of federal fraud charges witnessed by several hundred people at once. "This court," Judge Pruitt said, after a pause that stretched long enough for Colgrove's face to go from flat fury to something closer to alarm. Cannot in good conscience proceed with a sale premised upon a fraudulent instrument. The original terms of the note, dated to next March, are hereby restored, and this matter is referred to the appropriate federal authority for investigation of the forgery. He did not look at Colgrove as he said it, which told Calvin everything he needed to know about how quickly reputations could shift once the crowd itself became the true jury. Colgrove did not wait for the crowd's judgment to fully turn. He moved, fast for a man of his years, shoving past the two hired men at his side, and for one terrible moment Calvin thought he meant to draw a weapon, and his own hand went instinctively to Mabel's shoulder to pull her back. But instead Colgrove simply ran, cutting through the startled crowd toward the horse pens at the edge of the square. And it was Mabel, quick as ever, who caught the whole intention of it in an instant. "He means to burn the mill before the marshal can reach it," she said, already moving. "He cannot win the sale, so he means to destroy the prize rather than let anyone else have it. Calvin, the mill." They rode hard for Cedar Ford, Deputy Marshal Root and two of his men following close behind, and Calvin, who 3 weeks earlier could not have kept his seat at a gallop for half a mile, found himself matching Mabel stride for stride across the 18 miles of Territory Road, his heart hammering with a fear sharper than anything he had felt at the creek crossing. Because this time it was not merely their own safety at stake, but the whole of what they had fought to save. They arrived to find one of Colgrove's remaining men already at the mill, a torch in hand, moving toward the stacked lumber and the dry timber frame of the sawhouse itself. And it was Daffod, alone at the mill that afternoon with only Dealey for company, who tackled the man bodily before the torch could touch the wood, the two of them grappling in the sawdust while Dealey, one hand still healing from the cut belt weeks before, waded in with a length of cordwood to end the struggle decisively. By the time Calvin and Mabel reined in at the yard, breathless, the fire had not caught. The man lay groaning in the dirt with Daffod's knee planted firmly on his chest, and Deputy Marshal Root, arriving moments later, took one look at the scene and simply shook his head with the weary resignation of a man who had seen a great many territorial land disputes end in fire and blood, relieved, this once, to find one that had not. Silas Colgrove himself was taken 2 days later, found at a rail depot in Guthrie attempting to board an eastbound train under an assumed name, and the federal charges brought against him, forgery, coercion, and conspiracy to commit arson, were substantial enough that even his considerable fortune could not entirely buy his way clear of them, though Calvin understood, with the pragmatic acceptance of a man who had lived long enough in the world to know it. That money would likely soften whatever sentence eventually came, and that the deeper injustice, a whole territory's courts and commerce bent for years to one man's convenience, could not be undone by a single trial, however satisfying. It was at least a beginning, and the mercantile and bank both passed, in the weeks that followed, into the hands of honest management appointed from Guthrie, and Judge Prout, disgraced by his own complicity, did not ride the Cedar Ford circuit again. The mill itself was never sold at auction at all. With the original loan terms restored and Colgrove's fraud exposed, Gethin Hale found himself owing $500 at 8%, due the following March, a debt that was, in the end, entirely manageable once the mill's true worth of contracts came back to it, freed from the fear that had kept half the territory's builders from doing business with a family Colgrove had marked for ruin. But Calvin's offer had never truly been about the debt alone, and when the immediate danger had passed, he made good on it anyway, not as rescue but as partnership freely chosen. He bought, with the money he had once meant for a hospital, a controlling share in the mill itself, enough to guarantee through the hardest weeks of winter that every wage owed to Dealey and Price and the other 10 men who depended on it would be paid in full, whatever contracts came or did not come, and Gethin Hale, rather than feeling the sting of a stranger's charity, found in it instead the steady, unglamorous comfort of a son-in-law who understood exactly what it meant to a proud man to be saved, without being made small in the saving. The first snow came in mid-November, early and soft, dusting the mill roof and the cabin porch in the bare cottonwoods along the creek, and it was on the evening of that first snowfall, with the mill fires banked low and the whole settlement of Cedar Ford settling into the particular hush that came over the territory each winter, that Calvin Conroy asked Mabel Hale to marry him, not with any great speech prepared, but simply standing beside her at the mill's head gate where they had first admitted their feelings to each other weeks before, the same place where the creek still ran cold and steady beneath a skin of new ice. "I have thought about how to say this properly," he told her, "and I find I have no fine words left that would improve on the plain truth of it. I love you, Mabel Hale, not despite the fact that you are stronger than I am in every way that matters out here, but because of it, and because you have taught me more about what a life is worth than 4 years of medical college ever managed. I would like very much to spend the rest of my winters, and my summers besides, learning the rest of what you have to teach me, as your husband, if you will have me." Mabel did not answer immediately, and for one heart-stopping moment Calvin feared he had misjudged everything. But then he saw that she was smiling, wide and unguarded, snow catching in her dark hair, and she reached up and pulled him down to her with both hands fisted in his coat collar, exactly as she had once hauled him free of a burning coach, and said, against his mouth, "I already pulled you out of one fire, Calvin Conroy. I do not intend to let you burn twice, or to let you go anywhere at all, so yes. Yes, I will marry you, and gladly, and I will teach you to swing that axe properly if it takes the rest of both our lives." They were married 3 weeks later, in the small, unfinished church at Cedar Ford, its steeple still not raised but its pews full for the first time since the town's founding, with Gethin Hale walking his daughter down the sawdust-swept aisle with tears standing openly in his eyes, and Daffod standing groomsman for a man he had, only 2 months before, considered entirely useless with an axe. And Dealey and Price, and all the mill families crowded into the small space, to see the doctor who had ridden into their lives in a burning wreck Mary, the woman who had saved him, and, in her own quiet, fierce way, been saved by him in turn. There was no honeymoon journey east, no grand tour of cities Calvin might once have imagined sharing with a bride. There was only the mill and the settlement and the long winter ahead of them, and neither of them wanted anything else. Calvin gave up the small room in the Linta for the larger cabin room that had once belonged to Mabel's parents, and Mabel, for her part, gave up nothing at all of who she had been, continuing to run the mill's books and half its labor besides, while Calvin rode his circuit through the scattered settlements each week, Elm Grove and Split Rock and the growing edges of the new Cherokee outlet claims, and returned each time to a home that had, in the space of a single autumn, become more entirely his own than any place he had ever lived. On the evenings when the whole territory lay silent under snow, and the mill wheel turned slow and steady in its half-frozen channel, they would sit together by the fire, Mabel with the mill ledger and Calvin with whatever medical journal had reached him last by the slow winter post, and talk, sometimes of the 12 families whose winter wages had been secured, sometimes of Whitcomb, who had taken a position at the honest new bank in Prairie Rose and written once to thank them both, sometimes of nothing at all beyond the particular comfortable silence of two people who had chosen each other with open eyes, knowing exactly what strength and what softness each brought to the life they meant to. "Bill, do you regret it?" Mabel asked him once, deep in December, watching the fire, her head resting against his shoulder. "The hospital you meant to build, the money spent instead on a mill in a settlement no one outside this territory has ever heard of." Calvin considered the question seriously, the way he considered any diagnosis, turning it over for the truth of it rather than the easy answer. "I have built something better than a hospital," he said finally. "I have built a home, and found in it a wife whose courage humbles me daily, and a family who took me in the moment I had nothing at all to offer them but a concussion and a ruined coat. I do not regret a single dollar of it, Mabel. I would spend it again tomorrow and every winter after, if it meant keeping this life exactly as it is. Outside, the snow fell soft and steady over Cedar Ford, over the mill and the creek and the whole wide, unfinished territory beyond it. And inside, by the fire, Mabel Hale, who was now Mabel Conroy, and would remain, for the rest of a long and well-loved life, precisely as strong and precisely as cherished as she had been the night she pulled a stranger from a burning coach, and decided, without quite realizing it yet, that she had found something in him worth keeping through every winter still to come.